Hello, and welcome back to our next presentation on CSS Layout and Positioning. In this presentation, I'm going to show you how to change the flow of a web page. So in previous videos, we looked at how to change different aspects of individual elements, such as the color or the font size or background color. All of those changes impacted individual elements or groups of elements and tags. Today, we're going to take a look at how to kind of reposition elements, how the elements interact with each other and show up on the page. So let's take a look at a web page that I've kind of created here, just some general stuff here about the Philadelphia Eagles. I've done a little bit of styling just to kind of emphasize a few things and set us up for our presentation. But what you'll notice in this is that it's just a very straightforward, I have a heading, I have some sections with some subheadings and paragraphs and images in there, and it pretty much just flows from the top to the bottom, directly relational to the HTML that I've put into here. All right, the HTML and the view that you see are pretty much the same. What I'm going to show you now is how to kind of change some of the aspects of how this is showing up. So the first thing I want to do is show you the visibility, which we talked about before. I set my visibility to hidden. Notice that it hides the element, but the element is still there in the flow, meaning the other elements respect the space that that element should be taking up. You just can't see the element here, but you can see where it should be positioned in the flow because it remains a part of the flow. Well, this is going to be shown with display that it's going to be a little bit different if I do none. So display none will actually completely remove that element from the positioning, from the layout, and all the other elements will now move up. They no longer represent or respect the fact that that element should be there. By just setting my display setting to none, all the other elements move. So we can take this out and get everything back to normal. I just want to show you the difference between display none and visibility, since we're talking about display. And the next thing I want to do is talk about the other display settings, such as display inline, display block, and display inline block. So here you see I've kind of set this up, my article from the Atlantic. This is a heading, an H3, and in it I have an anchor tag where I've attached a link to an article. Now this anchor tag is an inline element. And what that means is it's just going to sit exactly where it's located right now. So it's not going to cause a new line to be formed. It's just going to stay right beside all the other text that it has. Now the problem with display inline is that if I set my height, let's say I want to set the height of the overall H1, we'll set the height to say 100 pixels. So the height is a block element, which is why you see display block. It is going all the way to the edge of the screen, even though the content is very small. Since it's a block, it's going all the way to the edge. I can adjust the height to be 100 pixels of this heading, and you see that it changes. The height actually increases by 100 pixels. That's because I've changed the height. Now let's see how if we change the display to inline block, now you see how that changes the heading. Inline block will not automatically extend to the edge of the screen anymore. Inline block will only allow the content to decide the width. So if I was to add more letters or words into this heading, it would get wider, but it only get as wide as the content. Now I could change that. I could set the width back to say 100%. That gets me back to the full width of the screen. So that's kind of shows you a little bit about the difference between changing something from a block setting to an inline block setting. Down here in the H3, if I adjust this height, let's set this height to 100 pixels. We see that this anchor tag, its height did not change. Now, if maybe you're thinking, oh, that's because you changed the heading, and even though it's part of the heading, it's a little bit separate. So let's copy this and go back in here and show you that if I change the height, it still doesn't change for this anchor because the anchor is inline. Inline elements stay on the line that they're on, but you cannot adjust the height. So unlike the heading 1 and the heading 3, which were block elements, anchor elements do not allow you to change the height. But I can change my display from inline to inline block. What that's going to allow me to do is adjust the height now. So now by setting it to inline block, that previous inline element, which the height had no effect on it, now I've set the height to 100 pixels in the inline block with display inline block, and the height is now taking impact. And just to show you the difference between inline and inline block, because maybe you're wondering, why didn't you just set it to block? Why would I have to have inline block? Well, if I set it to block, then you notice this happens. Again, demonstrating the difference between inline block and block. Block would force it onto its own line. And again, you notice now it gets the width, automatically takes up the entire width of the page again. Whereas if it was still set to inline block, I'm able to change the height, but it does not create a new line and it does not cause it to stretch out across the entire width. And again, if I leave it as just plain inline, I'm only going to get the size of the content. Height and width have no impact on display inlines. All right, so that's a little brief discussion of the display settings. What we're going to look at now is positions. So position starts off with a static position. If I set this H1 with a static position, let's go ahead and get rid of some of these heights as well. We don't need these in here. So as a static position, it doesn't allow me to move anything. The element is static. It does not move. It does not change. For example, if I try to adjust the top positioning by, say, 30 pixels, nothing happens. It doesn't move. And that's because static keeps things where they are. But let's go back here. Let's say our next thing we want to look at is relative, a relative position. So when I adjust my relative position, again, you see nothing's happening yet. But that's because relative is now allowing me to change things. But changing it to relative won't move anything around. It won't remove anything from where it's currently positioned. It's only going to give you the ability to move. So if I come back in here and do a top 30 pixels again, now you see that it moves. It's moved down 30 pixels now. And if you notice, the other elements didn't move because they're still respecting the space that element should be taking up. But the element has been moved down in relation to the element that it's it is positioned inside of its ancestor. So let's take a look at this. Let's bring this out of here and maybe put it into our H3. So then we can show you a little something in here. So again, this H3 now has a relative positioning of 30 pixels, and you see it got pushed down. And let's change this new position. We can also push down my figure. So we'll put it in here. We'll do a position relative, and let's move this down, let's say 30 pixels as well. There you see it moves it down also another 30 pixels. So now it's back to the kind of the normal position. And yet the paragraph that was below that is no longer moved. So if I want to move everything, I kind of have to position and move everything down individually. I could also move it from, if I can push it from the right, say 40 pixels, you'll notice that this actually, if I say right 40 pixels, it actually goes to the left because I'm indicating which direction I'm pushing from or I'm offsetting from. I'm offsetting on the right side 40 pixels, so that pushes it from the right to the left and it moves over. So that's my positioning relative. Now let's take a look at what happens if I was to do something such as position absolute. At position absolute, now you see that H3 has moved all the way up to the top. And actually all three of the H3s, or both of the H3s, are up here on the top, on top of each other. And you can't actually see them. You can see that the Atlantic is kind of a little bit behind it and the discussion's there on top. But that's because I've positioned all of them in a single position. And it's absolutely 30 pixels from the top of its nearest positioned ancestor. And since none of my other elements have been positioned at all, they're all being absolutely positioned in reference to the body. And so they're all going to be exactly the same position, which is the body. And so if I was to go to a section, let's create a section here. And I go ahead and position this to relative. None of my sections are going to move, but what you'll notice now, because the section has been switched to position relative, now each of these H3s position absolute 30 from the top is no longer positioning them all from the top of the body. Now they're positioning them from the top of each of their own sections because the section is it's a closest positioned ancestor. So they are now 30 pixels from the top of the section that they are contained within, and they're no longer on top of each other. So that just kind of shows you something a little different and very important about when you're using the absolute position is you have to think about where it's contained and where it's going to be positioned from. And absolute positioning keeps it this amount of pixels from the nearest ancestor element that is already positioned. And so by doing that with the section, it's now in each section 30 pixels down. But notice absolute still allows me to scroll. I can scroll up and down and it moves. So it's set in a different position, but it still is able to scroll. Now let's change how that changes here. If I do something, say, and let's take this back to positioning the H1 since we only have one of those. let's do position fixed. So my position fixed, it's just kind of sitting there. It hasn't decided where it's going to be. So I can position this, let's move it top 50 pixels. And let's go left 40 pixels. And now you see it's there and it does not move. So that shows you the difference between position absolute and position fixed. Position fixed stays in an absolute position. Well, a fixed position, meaning it will not move. It's always going to be 50 from the top, 40 from the left. And that's in relation to the viewport, not to any element that is contained within. A fixed position is always in relation to the viewport, the entire window itself. All right. So let's take a look at one more that we are going to look at here, and that's going to be sticky. Let's look at the sticky position. The sticky position is actually going to allow us to move things. It's going to be relative until it hits a certain position. So right now, this is my normal flow. Everything is laid out the way it was originally. Because the position is sticky, Philly wins Super Bowl 52 is in a relative state. It's just moving along until it reaches the top 0 px of the element that it's in, which is the body. So as soon as that body hits the 0, then it stays, and it becomes like a fixed. It acts like a fixed location, a fixed position. Now let's take a look at. I've also got a little footer down here, and we could take a look at that as well and see a little aspect that could give you a little bit of trouble. So let's say I put this to sticky, and let's say bottom, and we'll say 0 pixels for the bottom. So there we go, position sticky 0. And that's because my position is relative here. So you see it stays right where I'm at, but I'm using the bottom 0 px so that when I'm all the way to the top, or I've scrolled all the way to the bottom, then this is above 0 pixels. So it scrolls. But if I move down, as soon as it hits to the 0 pixels, it will not push down any further. Everything else kind of moves behind it. And so I have the top up there and I have the bottom down here. And so these two aspects will always be on the page. But notice in the bottom, the Philadelphia Eagles is on top of everything. But up here on the top, Philly wins Super Bowl 52. The picture is going over top of everything, kind of crosses over it. And what's happening there is all about when it's written in the code. Since the Philadelphia Eagles is the last, it's always going to be on top. And the H1 is first, it's always going to be on the bottom if I don't change it. So how do I change it? Well, I change its Z index. So if I do Z index, and I just have to choose a number greater than the index of other values. So, since it's the only one that's going to have one, I could choose 1. And now Phillies win Super Bowl stays on top because it has a higher index than the other aspects. But let's say I come down here and I do this section and for some reason I give it a Z index of 3. Well, now it's back behind that section again. It's no longer in front because Z index 3 is higher than Z index 1, and so it gets positioned behind it again. Well, I could always make that a larger number, say 81. And so the numbers don't really matter. what matters is which one's greater, right? It doesn't give it any kind of effects or anything. As long as the number is greater of the z-index, it will exist on top. And now let's take a look at one more thing here. And what we're going to look at is how to float elements. So right now, we can position things, we can move things around, we can talk about what's on top, what's on bottom. But what we have to do here, let's get the z-index of this section off here because it's messing with my bottom. There we go. Much better. All right. So what's happening here is I have this image and I have this text, but the text, the paragraph, is sitting kind of below the image. I want them to kind of be wrapped around each other, so kind of wrap around the image. And you might see this in newspapers. Maybe you do it on your Google Docs or Word documents. So the question is, how do we do it on the web page? We're going to do that with what we call a float. So I'm going to float this picture of foals to the right. When I float it to the right, it comes over and everything else wraps around it. So this paragraph will come up behind it and it's going to sit right beside it. So that's how I wrap it. Now down here, I could do a float, and let's float this to the left, and you just see the difference there. So floating to the right pushes it to the right. The other elements below it come up and fill that space. So it's still going to stay below the element that comes in front of it, but the element that comes after it is able to fill the space that's left from floating it over to the right or over to the left. Now, let's say I don't really want these paragraphs. If it's a paragraph, I don't want the paragraph to come up. I want the paragraph to stay below. Well, I could set that with what's called a clear setting. So if I clear on the left, notice the element that was floated to the left, this picture of the Philly special, it was floated left. So when I clear left of the paragraph, it means any paragraph that comes in contact with an element that's been floated left will no longer clear that element. It will only clear elements that are floated to the right, but it will not clear elements that are floated to the left. So if I change this to right, now my paragraphs will not clear elements that are on the right, but it will clear an element that is floated to the left. So that switches it back and forth. So you can kind of see how it positions itself. If it floats right and the next element is clear right, they will not float with each other. They won't wrap, okay? There is one more setting, and that's a clear both. If I clear both, then my paragraphs will not clear any of the elements that are floated on either side. But there's no reason to float and then clear both, so let's go ahead and get those floating back into position where we want them to float. And there we go. There's some simple ways to kind of move things around on your page. Hopefully you see how to float, how to clear from the floats, and see how that might be useful for your page. All right, I hope you found this to be useful. Let me know if you have questions.